Before we dive into this story, drop a comment below and tell us where you're watching from. Enjoy the story. Christmas Eve, 2024. I should have known something was wrong the moment my daughter Rebecca walked through that door. At 68 years old, I've learned to read the subtle signs that life throws at you. But that night, I was too caught up in the warmth of family tradition to notice the storm brewing in my own dining room. The table was set perfectly. Margaret's fine china that we only used for special occasions, the same red tablecloth we'd used for 30 years, candles flickering against the winter darkness outside our Ohio home. My grandson Tyler, barely 10, was excitedly telling everyone about his new bicycle, while his twin sister Emma showed off the bracelet she'd made in art class. James, my son-in-law, seemed unusually quiet, but I attributed it to the stress of his demanding job at the law firm. Rebecca sat across from me, her designer dress immaculate, her lawyer's composure intact. She'd always been beautiful, inherited her mother's graceful features and determined spirit, but there was something different in her eyes that night, a coldness I hadn't seen since she was a teenager going through her rebellious phase. "Dad, could you pass the gravy?" she asked, her voice pleasant enough, but there was an undertone I couldn't quite place. "Of course, sweetheart," I replied, reaching across the table. As I handed her the gravy boat, our fingers briefly touched, and I felt her pull away just a little too quickly. That's when my phone buzzed. Now, I'm old-fashioned about technology. I don't check my phone during family dinner. Margaret raised me better than that. But something made me glance at the screen, a text message from an unknown number. I opened it, and the words hit me like a physical blow. "You're a disgrace. Leave now." The fork slipped from my hand, clattering against Margaret's precious china. The sound seemed to echo in the sudden silence that had fallen over our table. Emma looked up from her mashed potatoes, confused by the tension. Tyler stopped mid-sentence about his bicycle adventures. I looked around the table, my heart pounding. Did someone... I started to ask, but the words died in my throat when I saw Rebecca's face. She wasn't surprised. She wasn't confused. She was watching me with the calculated precision of a lawyer who had just presented devastating evidence to a jury. "Rebecca," I whispered, my voice barely audible. She set down her wineglass with deliberate care, dabbed her lips with her napkin, and looked directly into my eyes. "Did you read the message, Dad?" The way she said, "Dad," it wasn't the warm, loving tone I remembered from her childhood. It was clinical, distant, almost mocking. I don't understand," I stammered, feeling suddenly very old and very small in my own dining room. James shifted uncomfortably in his seat, reaching for Emma's hand as if to shield her from whatever was about to happen. The children sensed the change in atmosphere, that animal instinct kids have when adults are about to say or do something that will change everything. Rebecca stood up slowly, her movements graceful and predatory. "Then let me make it crystal clear for you." Her voice was steady, professional, the same tone she probably used in courtrooms to destroy opposing witnesses. She walked around the table until she was standing right behind my chair. I could feel her presence like a weight on my shoulders, and for some inexplicable reason, I was afraid to turn around and look at her. "I sent that message," she said, her words falling like hammer blows, and I meant every single word. The room spun around me. The familiar warmth of our dining room suddenly felt suffocating. Margaret's portrait on the mantelpiece seemed to be staring at me in disappointment. The Christmas tree lights blurred as tears I didn't realize I was crying filled my eyes. "Rebecca, what are you talking about?" I managed to whisper, finally turning to face my daughter. But the woman standing behind my chair wasn't the little girl who used to climb into my lap to hear bedtime stories. This was someone else entirely, someone with 30 years of accumulated anger burning in her eyes like a furnace. She leaned down until her face was inches from mine, and in a voice so quiet that only I could hear, she whispered, "I remember everything, Dad, everything." The house felt like a tomb after everyone left. James had quickly gathered the children, mumbling something about an early morning, while Rebecca simply walked out without another word. I sat alone at that table for 3 hours, staring at the cold turkey and congealed gravy, trying to make sense of what had just happened. I remember everything, Dad, everything. Those words kept echoing in my mind like a broken record. Remember what? What could she possibly remember that would make her hate me so much? I was a good father, wasn't I? I found myself walking upstairs to Rebecca's old bedroom, something I hadn't done in years. Margaret always said I should convert it into an office or a guest room, but I could never bring myself to change it. Even now, at 35, part of me still saw Rebecca as my little girl. The room was exactly as she'd left it when she went to college. Pink walls that she'd insisted on when she was 7, a bookshelf filled with Nancy Drew mysteries, and later law books from her teenage years when she'd already decided she wanted to follow in her mother's footsteps. Margaret had been a paralegal before Rebecca was born, smart as a whip, that woman. I sat on Rebecca's old bed and picked up the stuffed elephant that used to be her favorite, Mr. Peanuts. That's what she called him. I remembered the day I bought it for her at the county fair. She couldn't have been more than 6 years old, and she'd seen this enormous grey elephant at the ring toss game. I must have spent $50 trying to win the damn thing, but when I finally did, the look on her face made every penny worth it. She hugged that elephant every night for years. Used to tell me and Margaret that Mr. Peanuts protected her from the monsters in her closet. I'd tuck them both in, kiss her forehead, and she'd whisper, "I love you, Daddy. You're my hero." When did she stop saying that? When did I stop being her hero? I opened her old dresser drawer, and there it was. A letter in her childhood handwriting, probably from when she was 8 or 9. The paper was yellow with age, but the words were still clear. "Dear Daddy, thank you for teaching me to ride my bike. I fell down a lot, but you were always there to pick me up. You make everything better. I want to be just like you when I grow up. You're the best daddy in the whole world. Love, your Princess Rebecca." Reading those words felt like someone was driving a knife through my chest. This was my Rebecca, my sweet, loving little girl who used to bring me dandelions from the backyard and call them flowers for the best daddy ever. What happened to her? What happened to us? I thought about her teenage years. Sure, she'd been difficult sometimes. What teenager isn't? After Margaret died when Rebecca was 16, we both struggled. I was drowning in grief, working long hours at the construction company to avoid coming home to an empty house that still smelled like my wife's perfume. Rebecca threw herself into her studies, determined to get into a good college and make something of herself. But we got through it together, didn't we? I was so proud when she graduated valedictorian, even prouder when she got into Harvard Law School. I thought I'd done something right, raising a daughter who could achieve anything she set her mind to. I remembered her graduation from law school. I sat in that auditorium, a rough construction worker surrounded by lawyers and professors, bursting with pride as my daughter walked across that stage. She found me in the crowd afterward, still in her cap and gown, and hugged me tight. "We did it, Dad," she'd whispered in my ear. "Mom would be so proud." That was 12 years ago. When did things start to change? I tried to pinpoint the exact moment, but it was more like a slow erosion. Phone calls became shorter and less frequent. Holiday visits became obligations rather than celebrations. She stopped asking for my advice about anything. She stopped telling me about her cases, her life, her dreams. 5 years ago, when she got married, I walked her down the aisle with such joy in my heart. My little girl was starting her own family, but even then, something felt different. She was going through the motions, fulfilling the role of dutiful daughter, but there was a distance between us that I couldn't bridge no matter how hard I tried. And the grandchildren, Emma and Tyler, they barely knew me. Rebecca always had excuses for why they couldn't visit, why family gatherings had to be shorter, why I couldn't babysit them like other grandfathers did. I thought she was just being protective, maybe worried about my age or my health. But now, sitting in her childhood bedroom, holding Mr. Peanuts and that letter, I realized there was something else entirely going on, something I'd been too blind or too stubborn to see. I remember everything, Dad. What was there to remember? What had I done that was so terrible that my own daughter would humiliate me in front of my grandchildren on Christmas Eve? What kind of monster did she think I was? I looked at myself in her old vanity mirror, the same mirror where she used to practice her speeches for school debates. An old man stared back at me, with grey hair and deep lines around tired eyes. Was this the face of someone who could hurt his own child? The thought made me sick to my stomach. I didn't sleep that night. How could I? Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Rebecca's face, that cold, calculated expression that had replaced the warm smile I remembered. By 6 in the morning, I was already dressed and sitting in my truck outside her law office waiting. Henderson, Morrison and Associates was one of those fancy downtown firms with glass walls and marble floors, the kind of place that screamed success and money. I felt out of place in my worn jeans and flannel shirt, but I didn't care. I needed answers, and I wasn't leaving until I got them. The receptionist, a young woman with perfectly styled hair, looked at me like I was something that had crawled out from under a rock. "Sir, do you have an appointment with Ms. Harrison?" "I'm her father," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "Tell her Walter Harrison needs to speak with her." Ma. 20 minutes later, Rebecca emerged from an elevator, her heels clicking against the marble floor like gunshots. She was wearing one of those expensive business suits, her hair pulled back in a severe bun. She looked successful, powerful, and completely unrecognizable as the little girl who used to braid flowers into chains for me. "Dad, what are you doing here?" Her voice was professional, distant. She might as well have been talking to a stranger. "We need to talk, Rebecca, please." She glanced around the lobby, probably worried about making a scene in front of her colleagues. "Fine. 5 minutes. Conference room B." The conference room was all glass and chrome, with a view of the city that probably cost more per square foot than my entire house. Rebecca sat across from me, her hands folded on the polished table, waiting. "Rebecca, sweetheart, I don't understand what happened last night. What did I do? What are you so angry about?" She laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Sweetheart? Really, Dad? You're going to sit there and call me sweetheart after everything?" "After everything what?" "Rebecca, you're scaring me. I don't know what you think I did, but I don't think you did anything, Dad. I know what you did. The question is whether you remember or if you've convinced yourself it never happened." Her words hit me like a punch to the gut. "Remember what? Rebecca, please just tell me what you're talking about." She studied my face for a long moment, and I saw something flicker in her eyes. Was it disappointment, disgust, or maybe, just maybe, a trace of the sadness I was feeling? "The fact that you can sit there and ask me that question tells me everything I need to know," she said finally. "Our meeting is over." "Rebecca, wait." But she was already standing, already walking toward the door. "Don't contact me again, Dad. When I'm ready to deal with this, I'll let you know." The door closed behind her with a soft click, leaving me alone in that sterile conference room, more confused and desperate than before. I drove to James's office next. If Rebecca wouldn't talk to me, maybe my son-in-law would. James worked at a smaller firm across town, the kind of place that handled real estate and small business contracts. Nothing as high-powered as Rebecca's corporate law practice, but honest work. I found him in his cramped office, surrounded by case files and legal documents. He looked up when I knocked, and I saw something in his expression that made my stomach drop. Fear. He was afraid of me. "Walter, I didn't expect to see you here." "James, I need to understand what's happening. Rebecca won't talk to me. She says I did something, but I don't know what. Can you help me?" He ran his hands through his hair, a nervous gesture I'd seen him do when he was stressed. "Walter, I think you should talk to Rebecca about this. It's not my place." "She won't talk to me. You're my son-in-law, James. You've been part of this family for 5 years. Surely you can give me some idea of what's going on." He was quiet for a long time, staring at his hands. When he finally looked up, his expression was pained. "Rebecca has been going to therapy, Walter, for about 3 years now." "Therapy? Why? Is she sick, depressed?" "No, not that kind of therapy. She's been working with someone who specializes in childhood trauma." But the words hit me like a physical blow. Childhood trauma? What childhood trauma? I gave that girl everything. I loved her with every fiber of my being. Walter, I can't. I shouldn't be telling you this. But Rebecca has been recovering memories. Things that happened when she was young. Things she says she blocked out for years. What kind of things? James stood up and walked to his window, his back to me. She says you hurt her, Walter, physically, when she was little. The room started spinning. I grabbed the edge of his desk to steady myself. That's impossible. I would never hurt Rebecca. She was my princess, my everything. How could she think that? I don't know what to believe, Walter. I wasn't there, but Rebecca is. She's very convincing, and she's collected evidence. Evidence? What kind of evidence? He turned around, and I could see the conflict in his eyes. Medical records, hospital visits when she was a child, incidents that don't match the explanations that were given at the time. I felt like I was drowning. James, I swear to you, I never laid a hand on that child in anger. There must be some mistake, some misunderstanding. Maybe there is, he said quietly. But Walter, you need to understand something. Rebecca believes it happened. And whether it did or didn't, her pain is real. She's been carrying this around for years, trying to figure out how to deal with it. So she decided to humiliate me in front of my grandchildren on Christmas Eve. She decided she couldn't pretend anymore. She couldn't sit at that table and act like everything was fine when inside she was falling apart. I sank into the chair across from his desk, feeling every one of my 68 years. James, I need you to believe me. I never hurt my daughter. I don't know where these memories are coming from, but they're not real. He came around the desk and put his hand on my shoulder. Walter, I want to believe you. I really do. But you need to understand, this isn't just about what you remember or don't remember. This is about Rebecca's truth, and right now, that's the only truth that matters to her. As I drove home, James's words echoed in my mind. Medical records, hospital visits, evidence that didn't match the explanations. What explanations? What hospital visits? I sat in my driveway for an hour, trying to remember every time Rebecca had been hurt as a child. There was the time she fell off her bike and scraped her knee, the time she got food poisoning from bad chicken at a school picnic, the time she broke her wrist falling out of the old oak tree in our backyard. But then I remembered something else, something that made my blood run cold. When Rebecca was 8, she'd been hospitalized overnight. A concussion, I thought. She'd fallen off her bike and hit her head on the pavement. I remembered sitting beside her hospital bed, holding her small hand, promising her everything would be okay. But as I sat there in my truck, trying to piece together that long-ago night, I realized something terrible. I couldn't remember the details. I couldn't remember how she'd fallen, or where, or what I'd been doing when it happened. All I could remember was the fear in her eyes when she woke up in that hospital bed, and the way she'd flinched when I reached out to touch her face. The next morning, I found myself digging through boxes in my basement, looking for Rebecca's old medical records. Margaret had been meticulous about keeping everything. Report cards, vaccination records, insurance papers. Somewhere in this dusty maze of cardboard boxes was the truth about that night when Rebecca was 8. It took me 3 hours to find the right box. When I opened it, the smell of old paper and Margaret's lavender sachets hit me like a wave of nostalgia. There were photos of Rebecca's first steps, her kindergarten graduation, and underneath it all, a manila folder labeled Rebecca Medical. My hands shook as I opened it. The hospital admission form was dated March 15, 1997. Rebecca Harrison, age 8, admitted for observation following head trauma. But as I read further, my blood turned to ice. Patient presented with concussion, bruising consistent with blunt force trauma to the left temple. Minor lacerations on arms and legs. Father reports bicycle accident, but injury pattern suggests alternative cause. Social services consulted, but no action taken due to families' standing in community. Social services? Alternative cause? What the hell did that mean? I read the doctor's notes 3 times, but the words didn't make sense. The doctor who examined Rebecca was Dr. Samuel Morrison, the same Dr. Morrison who'd been our family physician for 20 years. He was retired now, living in the assisted living facility on Maple Street, but maybe he'd remember something. The Maple Street Senior Center smelled like disinfectant and overcooked vegetables. I found Dr. Morrison in the recreation room, playing chess with another resident. At 85, he was still sharp as a tack, his eyes lighting up when he saw me. "Walter Harrison, good to see you, son. How's that beautiful daughter of yours?" The irony of his question hit me like a slap. "That's actually why I'm here, Doc. I need to ask you about something that happened a long time ago. When Rebecca was 8, she was hospitalized for a head injury. Do you remember?" His smile faded, and something cautious crept into his expression. "Walter, that was a long time ago. Why are you asking about it now?" "Rebecca and we're having some problems. She says I hurt her when she was little, but I don't remember it that way. I found her medical records, and there's mention of social services being called. I need to understand what happened." Dr. Morrison was quiet for a long moment, studying the chess pieces on the board between us. "Walter, some memories are buried for good reasons." "What does that mean?" "It means that sometimes when something is too painful to remember, our minds protect us by forgetting, but that doesn't mean it didn't happen." My heart was pounding so hard, I thought it might explode. "Doc, are you saying I hurt my daughter?" "I'm saying that when Rebecca came to the hospital that night, her injuries weren't consistent with a bicycle accident. The bruising pattern, the location of the head trauma, it looked more like she'd been struck by something. Or someone." The room started spinning. I gripped the arms of my chair, trying to steady myself, but I loved her. I would never. "Walter, you'd been drinking heavily after Margaret died. Do you remember that?" "Margaret died when Rebecca was 16, not 8. But then I realized what he was talking about. Margaret hadn't died when Rebecca was 16. That was when she'd been diagnosed with cancer. She'd actually died 2 years later, when Rebecca was 18 and already in college. But there had been another death earlier. Margaret's mother, who'd lived with us for a while when Rebecca was small. Grandma Rose had died suddenly of a heart attack when Rebecca was 7. And yes, I'd struggled with that loss. I'd started drinking more than I should have. "I remember being sad about Rose," I whispered. "And yes, I drank some, but I never hurt Rebecca. The night she came to the hospital, you smelled like alcohol, Walter. You were agitated, defensive. You kept insisting it was a bicycle accident, but Rebecca was too scared to confirm your story." "Scared? Scared of what?" "Scared of you." Those 2 words hit me like a physical blow. I could feel the blood draining from my face, my hands starting to shake. No, that's not possible. Rebecca loved me. She called me her hero. Children often love the people who hurt them, Walter. It's one of the cruelest aspects of abuse. The child's need for love is so strong that they'll find ways to forgive almost anything. I stood up abruptly, knocking over the chess pieces. Several other residents looked over at us, but I didn't care. "I need to go. I need to think." "Walter, wait." Dr. Morrison's voice was gentle but firm. "If you're ready to face the truth, there might be a way to help both you and Rebecca heal, but you have to be willing to remember, even if it's painful." I drove home in a haze, Dr. Morrison's words echoing in my mind. When I got to my house, I went straight to the liquor cabinet, something I hadn't opened in years, and poured myself 3 fingers of whiskey. Then I sat in my recliner and tried to force myself to remember that night in March 1997. Rebecca would have been in 2nd grade. It was a Friday night, I think. I'd been working late at the construction site, and when I came home, the house was quiet. Margaret? No, not Margaret. Margaret was already sick by then, spending most of her time in bed. Rose had been taking care of Rebecca, but Rose was gone, dead for almost a year. I'd been handling everything alone, work, Rebecca, a dying wife. And yes, I'd been drinking, not just that night, but most nights. It was the only way I could get through the pain of watching Margaret waste away. Rebecca had been in her room, playing with her dolls. I'd told her to clean up her toys and get ready for bed, but she'd ignored me. I'd called her twice, then 3 times. I was tired, frustrated, grieving, and I'd had too much to drink. The memory was starting to come back now, like a photograph slowly developing in a dark room. I'd gone to her room, and she was still playing, her toys scattered across the floor. I'd raised my voice, told her to listen when I was talking to her. She'd looked up at me with those big brown eyes, Margaret's eyes, and said something. What had she said? "I miss Grandma Rose. I wish she was here instead of you." Oh, God. The memory hit me like a freight train. She'd said she wished her dead grandmother was there instead of me, and I'd lost it, completely lost it. I'd grabbed her by the shoulders, shaking her, telling her she was ungrateful, that I was doing my best. And then she'd tried to run away from me, tried to get to the door, but I'd been blocking her path, and in her panic to get away, she'd tripped. No, that wasn't right. I'd pushed her. I'd actually pushed my 8-year-old daughter, and she'd fallen backward, hitting her head on the corner of her dresser. The sound of her skull hitting that wood was something I'd buried so deep, I'd convinced myself it never happened. But now, it was all coming back. The blood, her unconscious body, the panic as I realized what I'd done. I'd made up the bicycle story on the way to the hospital, told everyone she'd been riding her bike and hit a pothole, and Rebecca, when she woke up, had been too scared to contradict me. I'd convinced myself it was an accident, that she'd fallen, but the truth was, I'd pushed my own daughter hard enough to give her a concussion. I'd hurt the person I loved most in the world because I was drunk and grieving and couldn't handle a child's innocent comment about missing her grandmother. The whiskey glass slipped from my hands, shattering on the floor, but I barely noticed. All I could think about was Rebecca's face in that hospital bed. The fear in her eyes when she looked at me, the way she'd flinched when I tried to comfort her. She remembered everything, and she had every right to hate me. The memories came flooding back like a dam bursting. Once I remembered that night, really remembered it, other incidents started surfacing from the depths of my mind where I'd buried them for decades. I sat in my living room for hours, the broken glass still scattered at my feet, reliving moments I'd convinced myself never happened. The whiskey was gone, but I didn't need alcohol anymore to see the truth. It was all there, waiting for me to be brave enough to face it. There was the time Rebecca spilled juice on Margaret's favorite tablecloth. She couldn't have been more than 6. I'd grabbed her wrist so hard I left bruises, screaming at her about being more careful. She'd cried for an hour, and I'd told Margaret that Rebecca had fallen off the monkey bars at school. There was the Christmas when she was 7, just a few months after Rose died. Rebecca had accidentally knocked over the tree while playing, and ornaments, some of them Margaret's family heirlooms, had shattered across the living room floor. I'd lost my mind, yelling at her, calling her clumsy and stupid. When she'd tried to apologize, tried to hug me, I'd pushed her away so hard she'd hit the wall. And there were so many smaller moments. Grabbing her arm too tightly when she wasn't walking fast enough, yanking her hair when she wouldn't sit still during church, shaking her when she cried too loudly while Margaret was trying to rest. I'd been a monster, a drunk, grieving monster who took out his pain on a little girl who'd needed me to be strong for her. The worst part was remembering how Rebecca had tried to love me anyway, how she'd bring me pictures she'd drawn at school even after I'd hurt her, how she'd still climb into my lap sometimes, desperate for affection, even though I could see the fear in her eyes, how she'd tell me she loved me even when I'd been too angry or too drunk to say it back. She'd learned to read my moods, to stay out of my way when I was drinking. I remembered finding her hiding in her closet once, curled up with Mr. Peanuts, whispering to her stuffed elephant that they had to be very quiet so Daddy wouldn't get mad. How had I forgotten all of this? How had I convinced myself I was a good father when the evidence of my failures was written all over my daughter's childhood? But I knew how. After Margaret died, after Rebecca left for college, I'd stopped drinking. I'd gotten my life together, started going to church, became a respected member of the community. I'd needed to believe I was a good man, so I'd rewritten history in my mind. I'd kept only the good memories. Teaching Rebecca to ride her bike, helping with homework, the times she'd called me her hero, and buried everything else so deep I'd genuinely forgotten it happened. Except Rebecca hadn't forgotten. She'd carried every bruise, every cruel word, every moment of terror through her entire life. And somehow she'd still managed to become successful, to build a family, to make something beautiful out of the broken pieces I'd left her with. The phone rang, startling me out of my dark reverie. It was James. "Walter, we need to talk." "James, I remember now. I remember what I did to her." My voice was barely a whisper. There was a long pause. "You do?" "I was drunk, I was grieving, and I took it out on her. God help me, I hurt my own little girl." "Walter, where are you right now?" "At home, why?" "Stay there, I'm coming over." 20 minutes later, James was sitting across from me in my living room, his expression serious. He'd brought a folder with him, thick with papers and photographs. "Walter, Rebecca didn't just remember on her own. She's been working with investigators, gathering evidence. She's been planning this for a long time." He opened the folder and spread papers across my coffee table. Medical records, police reports that had never been filed, statements from neighbors who'd heard shouting and crying from our house but had never called authorities. Mrs. Patterson from next door remembers hearing Rebecca screaming one night. She almost called the police, but then everything went quiet, so she assumed you'd gotten things under control. I picked up a photograph, Rebecca at age 9, at some school function. I'd remembered her as always being happy and smiling, but in this picture I could see what I'd missed before, the forced smile that didn't reach her eyes. The way she was standing slightly apart from the other children, the careful way she held herself, like someone who'd learned to be ready for pain. "There's more," James said quietly. "Rebecca hired a private investigator to track down people who knew your family back then. Your old co-workers remember you coming to work hungover, talking about how difficult Rebecca was being. The principal at her elementary school has records of her coming to school with unexplained bruises. Each piece of evidence was like a nail in my coffin. But worse than that, each one was a testament to how completely I'd failed the person who depended on me most." "James, what is she planning to do with all this?" He was quiet for a long moment. "She's filed a police report, Walter. She's pressing charges." The words hit me like a physical blow. Charges after all these years? There's no statute of limitations on child abuse in Ohio, not for cases this severe. I thought about what that meant. At 68 years old, I could go to prison for what I'd done to my daughter 30 years ago. I'd lose everything. My house, my reputation, my freedom. I'd probably die behind bars. But as I sat there, looking at the evidence of my crimes spread out on my coffee table, I realized something surprising. I wasn't angry about the consequences. I was relieved. For the first time in decades, someone was holding me accountable for what I'd done. Rebecca wasn't going to let me get away with hurting her anymore. She wasn't going to pretend it never happened, wasn't going to protect my reputation or spare my feelings. She was finally fighting back. "Does she hate me?" I asked James. "I think she's trying not to," he said honestly. "But Walter, you have to understand, she's not doing this for revenge. She's doing it because she needs to know that what happened to her mattered, that it was real and it was wrong, and she deserves justice." I picked up another photograph, Rebecca at 10, missing her 2 front teeth, grinning at the camera. But now I could see the slight flinch in her posture, the way she was leaning away from whoever was taking the picture, probably me. "I need to see her," I said. "I need to tell her I remember. I need to apologize." "Walter, she has a restraining order against you. If you try to contact her, you'll be arrested." A restraining order. My own daughter had gotten a restraining order to protect herself from me. Then what do I do? How do I make this right? James gathered up the papers and put them back in the folder. "I don't know if you can make it right, Walter. Some things can't be fixed, but maybe you can stop making it worse." After he left, I sat alone in my house, surrounded by the debris of my shattered life. For the first time since this nightmare began, I had a clear picture of what I'd done and what I was facing. I'd abused my daughter for years. I'd traumatized her so badly that she'd spent decades trying to heal from what I'd done to her. And now, finally, she was strong enough to hold me accountable. I deserved whatever was coming. 3 days later, the police came to my door. I'd been expecting them, but seeing those uniforms on my front porch still made my knees weak. Detective Sarah Martinez was younger than Rebecca, professional and cold. She read me my rights in my own living room, the same room where Rebecca used to play with her dolls. "Mr. Harrison, you're under arrest for multiple counts of child abuse. You have the right to remain silent." The words washed over me like white noise. All I could think about was how Rebecca must have felt, gathering the courage to walk into that police station and tell them what her father had done to her. How many times had she practiced those words? How many sleepless nights had she spent deciding whether to destroy the man who'd already destroyed so much of her childhood? They let me change clothes before taking me to the station. As I put on my good shirt, the one I wore to church, I caught sight of myself in the bedroom mirror. The man staring back at me looked every bit the monster I'd become. Grey, haggard, pathetic. The booking process was humiliating but somehow appropriate. Fingerprints, mugshots, the orange jumpsuit that marked me as what I truly was, a criminal. They put me in a holding cell with 3 other men, and I sat in the corner, trying to process the fact that my life as I knew it was over. My court-appointed lawyer was a tired-looking man named Robert Chen, who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else. He spread Rebecca's evidence across the metal table in the conference room, and I could see in his eyes that he knew this was a losing battle. "Mr. Harrison, I have to be honest with you. The evidence against you is overwhelming. Medical records, witness statements, photographs. Your daughter has built an airtight case." "I'm not going to fight it," I said quietly. He looked up, surprised. "Sir, I did it. Everything she says I did it. I'm not going to put her through a trial where she has to relive it all again just so I can try to get a lighter sentence." Chen set down his papers. "Mr. Harrison, if you plead guilty to all charges, you're looking at 15 to 20 years. At your age, I know what it means." He was quiet for a moment. "There might be another option. Your daughter's lawyer called this morning. They want to meet." Rebecca's lawyer turned out to be Victoria Stern, a woman about Rebecca's age, with steel in her eyes and ice in her voice. We met in a conference room at the courthouse, and she didn't waste time with pleasantries. "Mr. Harrison, my client is prepared to consider a plea arrangement, but she has conditions." "What kind of conditions?" "First, you will plead guilty to all charges. No reduced counts, no alternative explanations. You will stand up in court and admit, on the record, exactly what you did to Rebecca." I nodded. "I can do that." "Second, you will submit to a psychological evaluation and complete whatever treatment is recommended. This isn't negotiable." "Okay." "Third, you will have no contact with Rebecca, her husband, or her children unless and until she decides she wants contact. This includes no letters, no phone calls, no attempts to reach out through third parties." Each condition felt like a nail in my coffin, but I deserved everyone. "What else?" "You will liquidate your assets and establish a fund for victims of child abuse. Your house, your savings, your pension, everything except what you need for basic survival. My house, the house where Margaret and I had been happy before everything went wrong. The house where Rebecca had taken her first steps, spoken her first words. But it was also the house where I'd hurt her, again and again. Maybe it was time for it to belong to someone else. And if I agree to all this, she'll recommend a sentence of 5 years with the possibility of parole in 3. You'll serve your time, but you won't die in prison. Can I ask, why is she offering this? Why not just let me rot?" Victoria's expression softened slightly. "Because, Mr. Harrison, despite everything you did to her, your daughter is a better person than you ever were. She doesn't want revenge. She wants acknowledgement, accountability, and the assurance that you'll never hurt anyone else the way you hurt her. Ado. That afternoon I was released on bail, money Rebecca herself had posted, which felt like the deepest cut of all. I went home to an empty house that no longer felt like mine and found something waiting for me on my kitchen table. An envelope with my name written in Rebecca's familiar handwriting. Inside was a single sheet of paper with a phone number and a message. If you want to understand what you did to me, call Dr. Patricia Williams. She specializes in helping families affected by childhood trauma. The appointment is already scheduled for tomorrow at 2 p.m. Dr. Williams turned out to be a woman in her 50s with kind eyes and an office filled with comfortable chairs and soft lighting. She didn't judge me when I told her why I was there. She just listened. Mr. Harrison, what you're experiencing now, the sudden return of memories you'd suppressed, is actually quite common in cases like yours. The mind has remarkable ways of protecting us from truths we're not ready to face. But how did I forget hurting my own child? Because remembering would have meant acknowledging that you weren't the man you wanted to be. It would have meant facing the fact that you'd become like your own father. The words hit me like a physical blow. My father never hit me, didn't he? And suddenly, I was 7 years old again, cowering in a corner while my father, drunk and angry about losing his job, took out his frustrations on whoever was closest. I remembered the belt, the shouting, the way my mother would try to distract him when he got that look in his eyes. "Oh God," I whispered. I became him. I swore I'd never become him, and I did exactly what he did to me. The cycle of abuse is powerful, Mr. Harrison, but it can be broken. Rebecca broke it. She's never laid a hand on her children in anger. And now, by facing what you did, you're taking the first step toward breaking it too. It's too late for me to break anything. The damage is done. It's not about undoing the past, Dr. Williams said gently. It's about taking responsibility for it. Rebecca doesn't need you to erase what happened. She needs you to admit it happened, to acknowledge her pain, and to commit to making sure it never happens again. I spent 2 hours in that office, finally understanding the scope of what I'd done to my daughter. It wasn't just the physical abuse. It was the betrayal of trust, the destruction of her sense of safety, the way I'd taught her that love could be violent and unpredictable. When I got home, I did something I hadn't done in 30 years. I got down on my knees in my living room and prayed, not for forgiveness. I didn't deserve that, but for the strength to face what was coming and for Rebecca to somehow, someday, find peace. Tomorrow, I would stand in front of a judge and admit to the world what kind of man I really was. And for the first time since this nightmare began, I felt like maybe that was exactly what needed to happen. The news broke 3 days before my sentencing hearing. Someone had leaked the story to the local paper. Respected local businessman charged with child abuse. My mugshot was on the front page, and by evening it was all over social media. My phone started ringing at 6 in the morning and didn't stop until I finally unplugged it from the wall. Reporters camped outside my house, shoving microphones in my face whenever I tried to check my mailbox. The grocery store clerks, who'd known me for 20 years, suddenly couldn't make eye contact. My barber of 15 years told me he was too busy to fit me in his schedule. Harold Peterson, my next-door neighbor, and the closest thing I'd had to a best friend, knocked on my door that evening. I thought maybe he was coming to offer support, but the look on his face told me otherwise. "Walt, I need to ask you something, and I need you to tell me the truth." "Okay, Harold. Did you really do those things to Rebecca? Because if you did..." He shook his head, backing away from my door. "Jesus, Walt, I've known you for 30 years. I was at your wedding. I helped you carry Margaret's coffin. How could you do something like that to your own little girl?" I wanted to lie. God help me, I wanted to tell him it was all a misunderstanding, that Rebecca was confused or vindictive or mentally ill. But I couldn't add another lie to the mountain I'd already built. "Yes," I said quietly. "I did it." Harold's face went pale. "Then don't ever speak to me again." He walked away, and I watched through my window as he went to his garage and came back with a "for sale" sign that he planted firmly in his front yard. Rather than live next to a child abuser, Harold was selling the house he'd owned for decades. By the end of the week, my entire world had collapsed. The construction company where I'd worked for 40 years issued a statement distancing themselves from my actions. The church where I'd been a deacon removed my name from their membership rolls. The charity board I'd served on for 10 years asked for my resignation. But the worst part was the silence from people who'd claimed to care about me. Christmas cards I'd been receiving for decades suddenly stopped coming. Friends I'd known since high school acted like I'd never existed. The waitress at Murphy's Diner, where I'd eaten breakfast every Saturday for 20 years, refused to serve me. I'd become a pariah, and I deserved every bit of it. The isolation was suffocating. I spent my days alone in a house that felt like a mausoleum, surrounded by photographs of a family that no longer existed. There was Rebecca at age 5, gap-toothed and grinning, sitting on my shoulders at the county fair. Rebecca at 10, proudly holding up a science fair ribbon. Rebecca at 16, beautiful in her prom dress. In every photo, I could now see what I'd missed before. The tension in her posture, the forced smile, the way she always seemed to be leaning away from me just slightly. The evidence of my failures had been staring me in the face for decades, but I'd been too much of a coward to see it. On Thursday night, 3 days before my sentencing, I sat in my kitchen with a bottle of sleeping pills in one hand and a glass of water in the other. It would be so easy, just swallow them all and let the darkness take me. I wouldn't have to face the judge, wouldn't have to see the disappointment and disgust in people's eyes. I wouldn't have to live with the knowledge of what I'd done. But as I sat there, contemplating the easy way out, I thought about Rebecca. She'd survived what I'd done to her. She'd carried that pain for 30 years and still managed to build a life, to become successful, to raise children who would never know the fear she'd lived with. If she could be that strong, if she could survive what I'd done to her, then the least I could do was survive the consequences of my actions. I put the pills back in the bottle and went to bed. The next morning, my lawyer called with news that made my stomach drop. "Walter, Rebecca wants to give a victim impact statement at your sentencing." What does that mean? It means she's going to stand up in court and tell the judge how your abuse affected her life. She's going to describe in detail what you did to her and how it shaped her into the woman she became. The thought of Rebecca having to relive those memories in a public courtroom made me sick. Can I stop her? Can I ask her not to do it? You have no contact with her, remember? And even if you did, it's her right. Victims have the right to be heard. Will I have to listen to it? Unless you want to waive your right to be present at your own sentencing, yes. You'll be sitting 10 feet away from her while she tells the world what kind of father you were. That night, I had the dream again. The same one that had been haunting me since the night of the Christmas dinner. Rebecca was 8 years old, standing in her bedroom doorway, her face streaked with tears and blood. She was trying to tell me something, but I couldn't hear her over the sound of my own voice screaming at her. I woke up in a cold sweat, my heart pounding, but this time I could hear what she'd been trying to say in the dream. "I just wanted you to love me, Daddy. Why couldn't you just love me?" I spent the rest of the night crying for the little girl I'd failed, and for the man I could have been if I'd been strong enough to be better. Saturday morning, the day before my sentencing, I did something I should have done 30 years ago. I got down on my knees in Rebecca's old bedroom, surrounded by the remnants of her childhood, and I apologized. "I'm sorry, baby girl," I whispered to the empty room. "I'm so sorry for what I did to you. You deserved so much better than me. You deserved a father who protected you, who made you feel safe, who never ever hurt you." I knew she couldn't hear me. I knew it was too little, too late, but I needed to say the words anyway, needed to acknowledge what I'd done in the place where I'd done it. Tomorrow I would face the consequences of my actions. I would listen to my daughter describe the hell I'd put her through, and I would accept whatever punishment the judge deemed appropriate. It was the least I could do for the little girl whose childhood I'd destroyed. The courtroom was packed on the morning of my sentencing. I'd expected reporters and court officials, But I hadn't prepared for the sea of faces, some curious, some disgusted, some filled with the kind of righteous anger that comes when a community realizes it's been harboring a monster. I sat at the defendant's table in my only good suit, trying not to look at the gallery behind me. My lawyer, Mr. Chen, shuffled through papers nervously. He'd already told me that Judge Patricia Hawkins was known for her harsh sentences in child abuse cases, but none of that mattered when Rebecca walked into the courtroom. I hadn't seen her in person since that Christmas night 3 weeks ago. She looked older somehow, worn down by the weight of what she was about to do. She wore a simple black dress and carried a folder that I knew contained the statement that would finally give voice to 30 years of buried pain. She didn't look at me as she took her seat in the front row. James sat beside her, holding her hand, and for a moment I felt a stab of jealousy. Not because he had her love, I'd forfeited any right to that long ago, but because he got to be the man I should have been, the protector, the comforter, the one she could lean on when the world became too heavy to bear alone. Judge Hawkins called the court to order, and the proceeding began with my formal plea. I stood when asked and spoke the words that would seal my fate. Guilty, Your Honor, to all charges. The judge reviewed the terms of the plea agreement, the recommended sentence, the conditions Rebecca had insisted upon. Then she called Rebecca to the witness stand for her victim impact statement. I watched my daughter walk to the front of the courtroom, and for a moment she was 8 years old again, walking slowly toward my anger, knowing it would hurt, but having nowhere else to go. The parallel made me physically ill. She was sworn in, took her seat and opened her folder. Her hands were shaking slightly, but her voice was strong when she began to speak. Your Honor, my name is Rebecca Harrison Matthews, and Walter Harrison is my father. For most of my life, I convinced myself that the man sitting behind me loved me the best way he knew how. I made excuses for his anger, rationalized his violence, and blamed myself for provoking him. It's taken me 30 years and thousands of dollars in therapy to understand that none of what happened to me was my fault. She paused, took a breath, and continued. I want to tell you about the night I learned that love could be violent. I was 8 years old, and I'd just lost my grandmother, the only person in my house who made me feel truly safe. I was playing in my room, trying to forget that she was gone, when my father came home drunk. My hands clenched into fists under the table. I knew what came next, but hearing it from her perspective was like experiencing it all over again. Only this time, I could see myself through her eyes. He told me to clean up my toys. I was grieving and scared, and I wasn't moving fast enough for him. When he started yelling, I said something about missing my grandmother. I said I wished she was there instead of him. Rebecca's voice wavered slightly, but she pressed on. He grabbed me by the shoulders and shook me so hard my teeth rattled. He was screaming in my face, telling me I was ungrateful, that he was doing his best. I tried to get away from him, tried to run to my room, but he was blocking the door. When I tried to get past him, he shoved me backward hard. The courtroom was completely silent. I could hear my own heartbeat pounding in my ears. I hit the corner of my dresser with the back of my head. I remember the sound it made, like a melon hitting concrete. I remember the way the room spun, and then everything went black. She described waking up in the hospital, confused and terrified. How I'd coached her to lie about what happened. How the doctors suspected the truth but couldn't prove it. How she'd spent the next 10 years of her childhood walking on eggshells, never knowing which version of her father would come home each night. The physical abuse was terrible, she continued, but the psychological damage was worse. He taught me that love was conditional, that I had to earn affection by being perfect, and that any mistake on my part could result in violence. He taught me to be afraid of the people who were supposed to protect me. She talked about the nightmares that had plagued her well into adulthood, about the anxiety attacks she'd suffered whenever anyone raised their voice, about how she'd struggled to trust James enough to marry him, and how terrified she'd been during her pregnancy that she might somehow inherit my capacity for violence. The hardest part, she said, her voice breaking for the first time, was that I still loved him. Despite everything he did to me, I still wanted his approval, still hoped that someday he'd become the father I needed him to be. I carried that hope for 25 years before I finally realized it was killing me. Then she did something that surprised everyone in the courtroom, including me. She turned and looked directly at me for the first time since entering the room. I need him to know that his actions had consequences beyond the bruises and the fear. I need him to understand that every relationship I've ever had has been shaped by what he did to me in that house. Every time my children cry, I have to fight the urge to hide, because his voice screaming at me is still the loudest sound in my head. Tears were streaming down my face now, but I couldn't look away from her. This was my daughter, my little girl, and I had broken her in ways I was only now beginning to understand. But I also need him to know that I survived him. I built a life despite what he did to me. I married a good man who has never raised his hand to me in anger. I had children who will never know the fear I lived with. I became successful in a career where I protect other people's children from men like my father. She closed her folder and stood up. I'm not asking for revenge, Your Honor. I'm asking for acknowledgement. I want it on the record that what happened to me was real, that it mattered, and that it was wrong. And I want my father to spend whatever time he has left understanding the weight of what he did. As she walked back to her seat, she paused next to my table. For a moment, I thought she might say something to me directly. Instead, she reached into her purse and pulled out something small, a worn, faded photograph. She placed it on the table in front of me without a word. It was a picture I'd taken of her when she was 6 years old, sitting in our backyard with a crown of dandelions she'd made for herself. On the back, in her childish handwriting, were the words, "For Daddy from your princess." The message was clear. This was the child I'd destroyed. This was who she'd been before I taught her to be afraid. She walked away, and I held that photograph while Judge Hawkins sentenced me to 5 years in prison with the possibility of parole in 3. The gavel came down, but all I could think about was the little girl in the picture and how I'd traded her love for my anger. As they led me away in handcuffs, I caught one last glimpse of Rebecca. She was crying, but for the first time since this nightmare began, she looked like a weight had been lifted from her shoulders. She'd finally been heard, finally been believed, finally gotten the acknowledgement she'd needed for 30 years. It was the last gift I could give her, the truth. Prison was nothing like I'd expected. At 68, I was older than most of the guards, let alone the other inmates. They put me in a minimum security facility 2 hours from home, where I spent my days working in the kitchen and my evenings attending mandatory therapy sessions. Dr. Rachel Stone, the prison psychologist, was a no-nonsense woman in her 40s who didn't let me wallow in self-pity. Feeling sorry for yourself won't help Rebecca heal, she told me during our first session. The only thing that might help is if you use this time to become a better man than you were. I threw myself into the work of rehabilitation with the desperation of a drowning man. Group therapy, anger management classes, addiction counseling. Even though I'd been sober for 15 years, I needed to understand how alcohol had stripped away my ability to be the father Rebecca deserved. It was during one of these sessions, about 6 months into my sentence, that I received an unexpected visitor. James was waiting for me in the visitation room, looking uncomfortable in the sterile environment. We sat across from each other at a plastic table, surrounded by other inmates and their families, and for a long moment, neither of us spoke. "How is she?" I finally asked. "Better," he said. "The trial helped. Having her story heard, having you take responsibility, it's given her some peace." "And the children? They don't know the details. They know their grandfather did something wrong, and that's why he can't visit anymore. Emma asks about you sometimes." The mention of my granddaughter's name hit me like a physical blow. Emma, who I'd barely gotten to know because Rebecca had always kept our visits short and supervised. Now I understood why. "James, why are you here?" He shifted in his seat, clearly wrestling with something. Rebecca doesn't know I'm here. She'd probably be furious if she found out, but I needed to tell you something. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a manila envelope. 3 weeks ago, Rebecca got a letter. It was from your sister, Vivian. I frowned. Vivian and I hadn't spoken in years, not since she'd made some cruel comments about Margaret during her funeral. What kind of letter? She congratulated Rebecca on finally destroying you. Said she'd been waiting 30 years for someone to take you down. My blood ran cold. What does that mean? What does... James opened the envelope and pulled out several photographs and documents. Vivian sent these. They're pictures of you and Rebecca from when she was little. But look at them carefully, Walter. Really look. He spread the photos across the table, and I studied them with growing confusion. There were pictures of Rebecca with bruises, but in several of them, the bruises looked wrong somehow, too perfectly placed, too symmetrical. I don't understand. Look at this one, James said, pointing to a photo of Rebecca at age 9 with a black eye. Rebecca doesn't remember getting this black eye. It's not in any of her therapy notes, not in any of the incidents she's recalled. He pulled out another document, a medical record I'd never seen before. This is from a hospital visit when Rebecca was 10. The doctor noted suspicious bruising, but when we tracked down the nurse who was on duty that night, she remembered something interesting. Vivian was the one who brought Rebecca in. You were supposedly out of town on a construction job. My heart was pounding. Are you saying... I'm saying that Vivian has been manipulating this situation for decades. She hated you, Walter. She was jealous of your success, your marriage, your family. And I think she's been making Rebecca's abuse seem worse than it was. But I did abuse her, I said quickly. I remember now. I hurt my daughter. Yes, you did. And that's real. And it's terrible. But Walter, some of the evidence against you, some of the medical records, some of the photographs, I think Vivian fabricated them or exaggerated them. He showed me more documents, inconsistencies in medical records, photographs that had been altered, witness statements that didn't match the timeline of events. Why are you telling me this? Because Rebecca deserves to know the truth. All of it. Yes, you abused her, and yes, you deserve to be held accountable for that. But she also deserves to know that her own aunt has been manipulating her trauma for 30 years. That night, I lay in my narrow prison bunk, staring at the ceiling and trying to process what James had told me. Vivian had always been bitter, always jealous of what she perceived as my easier life, but to manipulate my daughter's memories, to exaggerate her trauma for the sake of revenge. I thought about the Christmas dinner, about how shocked I'd been by Rebecca's message. But thinking back now, there had been something orchestrated about it, something theatrical, almost like Rebecca had been prompted to act. The next morning I called James from the prison phone. I need you to do something, I told him. I need you to arrange a meeting between Rebecca and Vivian. But I need Rebecca to go in prepared, with questions about specific incidents. Can you do that? Walter, I don't know if Rebecca will... James, if Vivian has been manipulating my daughter's trauma, then Rebecca has been carrying lies along with the real pain I caused her. She deserves to know the difference. 3 weeks later, James called me back with news that made my stomach drop. The meeting happened, he said. And Walter, you were right. Vivian has been lying for years. What do you mean? Some of the medical records were forged. Some of the photographs were staged when you weren't home. Vivian has been feeding Rebecca false memories through suggestion and manipulation, making her believe her abuse was more severe and more frequent than it actually was. I felt sick, so I didn't. Some of it didn't happen. You still hurt her, Walter. The core trauma is real. But Vivian has been amplifying it, twisting it, using Rebecca's real pain as a weapon against you. How did Rebecca take it? She's devastated. She doesn't know what's real anymore. She's questioning everything, not just the false memories, but the real ones too. Vivian has destroyed her ability to trust her own mind. I hung up the phone and walked back to my cell, feeling like the world had shifted beneath my feet. I was still guilty of abusing my daughter. I still deserved to be in prison, but knowing that Vivian had spent 30 years manipulating Rebecca's trauma, using my daughter's pain as a tool for revenge, it filled me with a rage I hadn't felt since the night I'd pushed Rebecca against that dresser. That evening, I sat down at the small desk in my cell and began writing a letter. Not to Rebecca, I was still bound by the restraining order, but to the prosecutor who had handled my case. I told them everything James had shared with me, about Vivian's manipulation, about the falsified evidence, about how my sister had weaponized my daughter's real trauma for her own purposes. I ended the letter with a request. Please investigate this, not to reduce my sentence or excuse my actions, but because Rebecca deserves to know what's real. She deserves to heal from actual trauma, not from lies designed to destroy her father. 2 days later, I received word that the district attorney's office was opening an investigation into evidence tampering and witness manipulation. Vivian's 30-year campaign of revenge was finally coming to light. And for the first time since this nightmare began, I felt something other than guilt and despair. I felt hope that Rebecca might finally be able to separate the real trauma from the manufactured pain and begin to heal properly. But first, my sister would have to answer for what she'd done to my daughter. I was released from prison on a cold February morning after serving 2.5 years. The parole board had been impressed by my completion of every available rehabilitation program and the positive recommendation from Dr. Stone. But more importantly, they'd taken into account the new evidence that had emerged about Vivian's manipulation. My sister had been arrested 6 months earlier on charges of evidence tampering and witness manipulation. The investigation had revealed the scope of her deception, forged medical records, staged photographs, and years of psychological manipulation designed to amplify Rebecca's real trauma. Vivian had confessed everything in a fit of rage when confronted, admitting that she'd been planning my downfall for decades. James picked me up from the prison gates. We drove in silence for most of the trip, both of us lost in our own thoughts about what came next. "How is she?" I finally asked as we pulled into the parking lot of a small diner halfway home. Confused, angry, but also relieved in a way. She's been working with a new therapist, someone who specializes in disentangling real memories from false ones. We sat in a booth by the window, and James spread several letters across the table. "She's been writing to you. She hasn't sent them, but she's been writing." I picked up the first letter with trembling hands. It was dated 3 months after Vivian's arrest. "Dad," it began, and just seeing that word in her handwriting made my eyes fill with tears. "I don't know what's real anymore, Doctor. Peterson says that the core memories, the night I hit my head, the times you grabbed me too hard, the fear I felt, those are real, but so many other things. Vivian made me believe you hurt me in ways you never did. She made me remember things that never happened." Die. The letter went on to describe her confusion, her anger at being manipulated, and her struggle to separate her real trauma from the false memories Vivian had planted. But it also contained something I'd never dared hope for, a willingness to understand the difference between the father who had hurt her and the monster Vivian had made me out to be. "She wants to see you," James said quietly. "When you're ready." "When she's ready." "Is she ready now?" "I think so." We drove to Rebecca's house, the same one where she'd confronted me that Christmas 3 years ago. But this time, when I walked up to the front door, she opened it before I could knock. She looked older, more tired, but there was something in her eyes I hadn't seen in decades, a willingness to look at me without the filter of Vivian's manipulation. "Hello, Dad." "Hello, sweetheart." We sat in her living room, the same room where she destroyed my world with a text message. Emma and Tyler were at school, and James had gone to pick up coffee, giving us privacy for this conversation we'd both been avoiding for years. "I need you to know something," she said, her voice steady but quiet. "Finding out about Vivian doesn't erase what you did to me. You still hurt me, you still traumatized me, that's still real. I know. But it also doesn't erase the fact that I've been carrying lies along with the truth for 30 years. Vivian made me believe you were a monster. when really you were just broken. I thought about that word, broken. It felt accurate in a way that monster never had. I was broken, I agreed. I was grieving and drinking and taking my pain out on someone who needed me to be strong for her. That's not an excuse, it's just the truth. She nodded. Dr. Peterson helped me understand something. She said that people can do terrible things without being terrible people, that you can hurt someone you love without being incapable of love. Do you believe that? I'm trying to. We talked for 2 hours about the real memories versus the false ones, about how my grief over losing Rose had turned me into someone I didn't recognize, about how Vivian's jealousy had poisoned Rebecca's healing for decades. But mostly, we talked about forgiveness, not the kind that erases the past, but the kind that allows you to move forward. I can't give you back your childhood, I told her. I can't undo the fear I caused you or take back the times I hurt you, but I can promise you that I'm not that man anymore. I know you're not, she said. The man who hurt me was drowning in his own pain. The man sitting here now has learned to swim. Before I left, she asked me something that surprised me. Would you like to meet Sophie? Sophie, my youngest daughter. She was born 2 years ago while you were in prison. James and I decided that if you came out a different man than you went in, we wanted her to know her grandfather. She went upstairs and came back carrying a toddler with curly brown hair and Margaret's eyes. Sophie looked at me with the fearless curiosity that only small children possess. Sophie, this is Grandpa Walter, Rebecca said softly. The little girl studied my face for a moment, then reached out and touched my cheek with her tiny hand. Grandpa cry? She asked, noticing the tears I hadn't realized were falling. Happy tears, I managed to say. Grandpa has very happy tears. 6 months later, we gathered for Rebecca's birthday, the first family celebration I'd attended in 4 years. Emma and Tyler were cautious around me at first, but children are remarkably resilient when they see the adults they trust accepting someone back into the fold. Sophie had no such reservations. She climbed into my lap during dinner and fell asleep there, completely trusting in the way only someone who had never been given reason to fear could be. She doesn't know what you did, Rebecca said quietly, watching her youngest daughter sleep in my arms. And if you continue to be the man you've become, she never will. That's all I want, I said, to be the grandfather to her that I should have been as a father to you. You can't change the past, Dad, but you can help write a better future. As I drove home that night, I thought about the long journey that had brought us to this moment. The pain I'd caused, the lies Vivian had told, the years of separation and misunderstanding, but also the courage Rebecca had shown in facing her trauma, the strength she'd found to separate truth from manipulation, and the grace she'd shown in offering me a chance at redemption. I would never stop regretting the father I'd been. But for the first time in years, I had hope about the grandfather I could become. Some things can't be fixed, some wounds run too deep to ever fully heal. But sometimes, if you're willing to face the truth, all of it, not just the comfortable parts, you can find a way forward. Rebecca and I would never have the relationship we might have had if I'd been a better father. But we had something else now, a relationship built on truth, accountability, and the hard-won understanding that love doesn't erase hurt, but it can create space for healing. And sometimes that's enough. That's